They handed him a coat made of rags and laughed him out of the trench. 3 weeks later, he was the only reason that trench still had men in it. Dunkeld Fraser had never fired at a man in his life. 30 years, he'd fired at deer, reading a hillside the way other men read a newspaper, a broken fern, a shifted stone, a shadow that sat in the wrong place an hour too long. None of that meant anything to the quartermaster sergeant, who tossed him a telescopic sight the way he'd toss out a shovel. No instruction, no manual, just a nod and a number to sign. Here's the arithmetic nobody explained to him. A sight misaligned by 1/100th of an inch throws a bullet 9 inches wide at 100 yards. At 600, that error is over 4 feet. A man could aim perfectly, squeeze perfectly, and miss by the width of a doorway, and never once know why. That's what was killing his regiment. 5 men a day, 18 in one afternoon, for nothing more than raising a head over a badly built wall. The coat is what everyone remembers about Fraser. It was the least important thing he brought. The suit came in a canvas sack, no ceremony to it. A corporal tossed it at his boots like a burlap dog blanket and told him it was his now. Fraser turned it over in his hands. Strips of hessian sewn in uneven rows, clumps of dyed twine, a hood that smelled of tar and wet dog. Down the line, 2 riflemen from Kent saw it and started laughing before he'd even pulled it on. One of them called him a scarecrow. The other asked if he'd come to scare off crows or Germans, because from where he stood, he couldn't tell the difference. Fraser didn't answer. He'd heard worse said about stranger things back home, usually by men who'd never spent a night lying still on a hillside waiting for something to move. Nobody showed him how to wear it properly. Nobody showed him anything, really. The telescopic sight he'd been issued came the same way. Handed over by a quartermaster sergeant the way you'd hand a man a spade. Sign here, carry on. No manual. No zeroing range. No one to tell him that a sight knocked 1/100th of an inch off true could throw a shot 4 feet wide at 600 yards, and that a man could do everything right and still never understand why he'd missed. That was the arithmetic waiting to be paid for. The trench they'd built was proper. That was the trouble. Straight parapet, level sandbags, the kind of neat line an engineer could be proud of. Which meant that anything sticking up above it, a head, a shoulder, the top of a rifle, stood out clean against the sky, obvious as a nail in a plank. Fraser watched a man from B Company learn that the hard way on his second morning. Stood up to pass a message, forgot himself for half a second, and went down before the sound of the shot had finished crossing no man's land. Nobody saw where it came from. Nobody ever did. By the end of that week, the battalion had lost 18 men, not in an attack, not going over the top. 18 men doing nothing more dangerous than standing in their own trench on a day with no fighting scheduled at all. You could not shoot back at something you couldn't see. Officers walked the line afterward, squinting out at empty fields and broken tree stumps, and found nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, no telltale glint of a scope. Just German ground, quiet as a photograph, giving up not one clue. Fraser lay in his section of trench that night and understood something the officers hadn't said aloud yet. Somewhere out there was a man doing exactly what he'd done his whole life on a hillside back home, except this one was hunting people. Before any of this, Fraser's war had been a hillside in Perthshire, and his enemy had been a stag that didn't want to be found. He'd learned it from his father, who'd learned it from his. You didn't chase a deer, you waited for it to forget you existed. You picked a hollow with the wind in your face, and you lay there until your knees went numb and your coat soaked through, watching one slope for so long that the land itself started talking to you. That gorse bush hadn't moved like that yesterday. That patch of bracken was bent the wrong way. That shadow under the rock was 10 minutes older than the sun should have made it. Miss one of those details and you walked home with an empty pack and a family that ate porridge again. Get it right and there was venison on the table by supper. Nobody at home called it a skill worth mentioning. It was just what you did if you wanted to eat. Nobody had told Fraser that skill had a second use. When he signed his papers and crossed to France, he thought he was leaving that hillside behind for good, trading a stalking rifle for a war he understood even less. He had no idea he was bringing the only weapon that actually mattered. They put him in a hollow forward of the line, ground that had been rained on for a week, and hadn't finished draining. Within the first hour, the water found its way through his coat, his trousers, his boots, and settled there, cold as something that meant to stay. The temptation to move came in waves. A cramp built slowly behind his left knee until it felt less like discomfort and more like a demand. Every instinct he owned told him to shift his weight, just an inch, just enough to make it stop. He didn't. A man who fidgets is a man who gets seen, and out here, seen meant dead. By the second hour, a fly had found his cheek and walked the length of it, and he let it. Somewhere behind him, a rat worked through the grass, and he tracked it without turning his head, the same trick he'd once used on a stag that could smell a held breath. By the fourth hour, numb past feeling, he understood something the training back home had never needed to put into words. The suit wasn't what kept a man alive out here. Stillness was. Heather and burlap meant nothing to a pair of eyes across no man's land, if the man wearing them so much as twitched to ease a cramp. He lay in that flooded hollow until the light failed completely. Only then did he lift the glass to his eye. By 1916, the Army had finally found a word for what men like Fraser were doing, and the word was wrong in an interesting way. They called them sharpshooters, snipers. 9 groups formed up, 20 men to a group, roughly 200 of them altogether, and somewhere in a headquarters office, someone was satisfied that the problem had been named and therefore solved. It hadn't. What the paperwork missed, the man training them didn't. Major Hesketh Pritchard put it plainly. Despite the title on their papers, their value lay far more in observation than in shooting. Every one of them, he said, was a picked stalker, and a glassman first, a rifleman a distant second. 200 men was nowhere near enough to matter as a firing line. It was far too valuable a resource to waste as one. So the Army did something that made no sense on paper and perfect sense in practice. It broke them up. Scattered Fraser and men like him across the length of the front, 1 or 2 to a sector, not as triggers to be pulled, but as eyes to be trusted. Nobody in Whitehall had a category for that. There was no medal shaped like patience. But a battalion with one of them watching its ground stopped losing men to shots from nowhere, and nobody above Fraser's rank could quite explain why. He'd been watching the same stretch of German ground for 6 days before it gave him anything at all. It was a stone, not a large one, sitting at the edge of a collapsed wall 200 yards past the wire, and Fraser had passed his glass over it 100 times without a second thought. Then on the 7th morning it was in a different position, not moved far, barely a hand's width. But he'd spent 30 years learning that stones don't walk on their own, and neither does anything else that isn't being handled by a man trying very hard not to be seen handling it. He lay still and watched it for another 2 hours before he was certain. The shadow beneath it was wrong for the hour. Too deep, too square-edged for a rock that size. Someone had built a firing position under it, and was clearing his loophole a fraction at a time, patient as Fraser himself. He didn't reach for his rifle. He reached for his notebook and wrote down a bearing, a distance, a description precise enough that another man reading it blind could have walked to the spot with his eyes shut. That evening, the guns behind him fired 6 rounds on his coordinates. The wall came down in the 4th one. Nobody thanked him by name. The silence from that stretch of German line afterward was the only thanks that mattered. The head arrived in a crate marked for someone else entirely, and it looked absurd sitting in the mud. A papier-mâché face, painted the color of a man who hadn't slept in a year, made by a theatrical wig maker in London, who until then had spent his career dressing actors for the stage. It was fixed to a stick that ran in a groove cut into a board, and the trick was in how you raised it. Not smooth, not confident, badly enough to look like a mistake, well enough to look like a man who'd forgotten himself for half a second. Fraser had done this twice before, and hated it both times. His job was simple and unbearable. Hold the stick at exactly the right height, exactly the right speed, while somewhere out in no man's land a rubber tube fed a lit cigarette into the dummy's mouth so it seemed, from 400 yards, to be breathing. Then you waited to be shot at. The bullet came fast, the way they always did, and left 2 holes in the papier-mâché, one going in, one coming out. 2 holes made a line, and the line ran back across the broken ground to a single point on a map, a point where a man was lying who'd finally made one mistake. Fraser lowered what was left of the head, and beside him another man was already writing down the bearing. Nobody ever put his name on that either. Pritchard, the man who'd built the school Fraser and men like him had passed through, later broke the war into 3 plain phases. German dominance through 1914 and into 1915. Rough parity by the middle of 1916. And after that, an advantage that belonged to the British and never went back. Nobody could point to a single afternoon when it turned. It wasn't a battle. It was hundreds of afternoons like the one with the stone under the collapsed wall. Hundreds of battalions that stopped losing a man a day to a shot from nowhere and slowly forgot to be afraid of their own parapets. Pritchard was given the Military Cross in October of 1916 for teaching men to do exactly what Fraser had already taught himself in a Perthshire hollow years before he ever picked up a war. A contemporary of his later credited the whole effort, the training, the discipline, the patient watching, with saving something over 3,500 Allied lives. That number was offered as tribute, not as something counted and checked. Nobody who said it had a ledger to prove it. It should be heard the way it was meant, as men trying to put a size to a debt they knew they couldn't measure exactly, only that it was enormous, and that it had been paid for quietly, by people whose names weren't on the paperwork either. There's no citation with Fraser's name on it. Not one. Whatever happened to him after the guns finally stopped, the paperwork that survived the war doesn't say. No medal, no mention in dispatches, no line in a regimental history singling him out for the stone he spotted or the head he held steady while men shot at it. That isn't unusual. It's the rule, not the exception. Search the record for the men who did this work, and mostly what you find is silence, occasionally broken by a name that survived by accident. One of those accidental survivals belongs to a real man, not an invented one, a second lieutenant named C.B. McPherson, described by those who served with him as a true expert with a telescope and a map, who went to France at 62 years old. Lord Lovat had the age limit stretched just to get him there. 62. Hands that had held the same brass glass on the same Highland hills for 40 years, steady now on a parapet in a foreign country, doing the exact thing Fraser had spent this story learning to do. McPherson stands in the record for all the ones who don't. Fraser was never real in the first place, built from what the paperwork left out, but somewhere in that gap between one recorded name and hundreds of unrecorded ones, there was an actual man, lying in actual mud, watching a hillside that wasn't his, keeping people alive who never knew it.